Earlier this month, NATO launched large-scale war games in Poland near the Russian border. The operation, called Anaconda, involved thousands of troops and military hardware from NATO member states. It's the largest such exercise since the end of the Cold War. Later in the show, we will have perspectives from Washington, Moscow and Europe, but we begin with CCTV's Jack Barton, who joins us from Brussels. And Jack, these war games sound like a major show of muscle, NATO military muscle. What's NATO's argument for conducting these military exercises right now?
Well, as you just mentioned, they are enormous. It's 24 countries sending 31,000 troops, thousands of weapon systems into Eastern Europe, the biggest war game since the end of the Cold War, but also the first time since the Second World War that German tanks have rolled all the way across Poland to approach the Russian border. And NATO is, of course, arguing that this is all about coordinating the forces, that it is either rotating through Eastern Europe or have as a standby rapid reaction force. And that includes the 40,000-strong rapid reaction force it's building, as well as the so-called Spearhead Group, which can launch in within 48 hours. But NATO's also not hiding the fact that this is muscle flexing. It's all part of what US Defense Secretary Ashton Carter calls NATO's new playbook about moving away from reassuring member states to really aggressive deterrence. And so even NATO is really not backing away from the fact that this is muscle flexing and that these war games are a form of deterrence.
And what kind of response has there been from Russia to this?
Well, initially, at the start of the games, the Kremlin called it a threat to Russia. Moscow also pledged to hold war games as well on the country's west. And that's really what we've seen all along since the start of the crisis in eastern Ukraine, this tit-for-tat approach where Russia, then NATO, then Russia again hold these ever increasingly large war games. But in the past few days, we've really seen the rhetoric stepped up, with Russia saying that NATO is trying to push the region back into a new Cold War atmosphere. We've even heard from the deputy of Russia's Parliamentary Defense Committee saying they could deploy 2 new divisions or create 2 new divisions on the western border to counter NATO. But most of the rhetoric in the past few days has been to the new news out of this 2-day meeting that NATO plans to deploy thousands more troops into Eastern Europe near the Russian border.
Thanks, Jack. That's CCTV's Jack Barton reporting from Brussels. And for more now, joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's an expert on U.S. defense policy and military use. And also joining us via Skype from Basel in Switzerland is Jan Oberg. He is the director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research based in Sweden. Welcome to both of you to the show. Michael, let me start with you. These NATO exercises are the largest to be held since the end of the Cold War. Moscow says they are unjustified. Why is NATO carrying out these types of exercises at a time when there's heightened tensions between Moscow and the West?
Well, clearly NATO feels the need to reinforce the credibility of its deterrent and commitment to the Eastern member states, lest there be any doubt in Moscow's mind that some or even most members of the alliance aren't really taking their commitments to the newest members seriously and would rather back down in the face of a new crisis with Russia rather than come to the support of a potentially threatened Baltic state or Poland or Romania, for example. The allies have decided that it's very important to show solidarity and unambiguous commitment to those member states. I take your point that the scale here risks provoking yet another round of back and forth at a time when the crisis in eastern Ukraine seems to have at least leveled off at a low simmer. But I think that NATO is aware that to leave any ambiguity about its willingness to invoke Article 5 in the event of an attack on a NATO member state would be a risk that just can't be tolerated. So I think that's the genesis of this big exercise, as well as the new rotational deployments of the battalions to the eastern member states.
Right. And do you think that there is unity among all NATO member states on this exercise and the planned build-up of NATO troops in the east? Because there have been some reservations expressed both in France and in Germany. In fact, the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder said the planned build-up is a serious mistake.
Well, with all due respect to the former Chancellor Schroeder, he is the former Chancellor Schroeder. He has one voice, but most of his compatriots would seem to disagree as a matter of government policy. This is a formal NATO exercise. Not everyone is equally enthusiastic. Not everyone is participating at the same scale, but it is, after all, an alliance exercise. I think the real question here would be if there were a actual Russian military assault of one type or another on a member state, would all the allies collectively respond with military force? And my guess is, let's hope we never find out, my guess is that some would not, that some would play a more indirect support role, because everyone is basically allowed to interpret Article 5, the Mutual Defense Pact of the Alliance Treaty, as they wish in a given situation. Article 5 cannot commit any specific state to a specific action, and that's part of its strength, frankly, as long as the credibility of most of the partners, most of the allies responding is high enough to deter any kind of Russian action. So I think that's what it boils down to. On balance, this is a fairly strong show of alliance solidarity.
Jan Oberg, what do you make of these exercises and the planned build-up of troops and equipment by NATO in Poland and some of the Baltic states?
Way out of proportion of the problem. We're in a situation where during the old Cold War, the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, had about 70 to 80% of the military expenditures of NATO at the time. Today, Russia, standing alone, military expenditures are 8% of NATO's. Now, if you have a paranoid NATO being afraid of this and that, or if you seriously believe that Putin would be such an idiot in realpolitik terms to start a war when he has 8 horses and the others have 100 horses, I think we're far out. I mean, I think parts of the leadership in the West has lost sense of what is reality. They need a reality check. And if they like to play with taxpayers' money this way and make more tension than necessary, the very least they could do would be to learn from the leaders of Europe at the time of the First Cold War, where you had formidable intellectuals and people with civil courage like Willy Brandt, Bruno Kreisky, Olof Palme, Urho Kekkonen, and others, who knew how damn dangerous these games were and therefore started the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and made confidence-building measures so that, you know, accidents wouldn't happen. And actually that was what paved the way for the ending of the Cold War. Now, 25 years later, we're in a situation where things are worse than they were at that time. I'm appalled by the policies of the West in a situation where they're way stronger and had no reason to be, you know, hysteric about a threat from Russia.
Michael, do you believe that the NATO exercises are disproportionate? Because both the Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have made it very clear that it would be, to use their words, insane for Russia to invade a NATO member state.
Well, you know, maybe they could be a little smaller. But I think Jan and some of the others you just mentioned are missing the main point here. Russia doesn't have to do an old-fashioned assault on all of NATO. It can try to chip away. It can try to contribute to a disturbance of Russian-speaking populations in Latvia, for example, which would then perhaps lead to a crackdown, which Russia could then use to invoke the right of protecting Russian speakers, which is a right that Putin has claimed for himself anywhere in the world, and try to seize a small piece of NATO territory, not with the intention of conquering all of the West, but with the intention of essentially proving to the Baltic states that they belong in his sphere of influence, and essentially assuming that NATO would rather back down than bring that overwhelming force to bear and risk nuclear war, where Jan forgot to mention that we actually have parity with Russia. We don't have 100 to 8 superiority in the nuclear domain, and Putin may be calculating that we would blink rather than go to the brink. I think it's important in this situation that deterrence not fail, that our commitment be unambiguous. I've been a supporter of trying to find ways to create a new Central European security architecture that would not involve the expansion of NATO, and I was never in favor of NATO expanding to the Baltic states in the first place. I don't think Sweden or Finland or Belarus or any of the other current neutral states should be in NATO either, because I don't want to see further provocation. But having said that, we now have an alliance that includes these countries, which were forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union Union about 70 years ago. And now that we have this commitment, I think it's important that there not be any shroud of doubt in Putin's mind that we would back it up. So even if the exercises perhaps could be a bit smaller, it's Putin that started this crisis in Central Europe, and we have to be clear about our commitments.
Jan, what do you make of that, the fact that these two adversaries are not unequal? They have nuclear parity, for one, if it does get down to that. And, you know, to Michael's point, that it was Putin who started this.
The big issue here is that the war we are talking about is not on US territory, it's in Europe. And Europe is very close to Russia. There ought to be much more caution on the West. Because if you imagine that somebody was playing with the idea of a huge military alliance trying to make Mexico or Canada members of that alliance against the US, there would also be reaction and fear and maybe overreaction in Washington. Secondly, I don't know what is meant by Putin who started this. It's like, you know, we're in a sandbox. He was the one who started the game and all that. The facts are the following. 25 years after the Cold War ended, we've had 25 years where we could have created a better Europe, such a Europe that, for instance, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev suggested, with the United Nations based in Europe, with a strong OSCE. And as Mike said, instead we chose triumphalistically to expand NATO. Now, why should we not have done that? Because American presidents and foreign ministers like James Baker, Hans-Dietrich Genscher in Germany and others promised Gorbachev that one, NATO would not expand, and two, a united Germany would not be in NATO, but would be neutral. Now, these things were not written down, but it's on the records anyhow. So Clinton took over in, if I remember correctly, 94, and started the expansion. I happened to be in Tbilisi at the time, Georgia, and there I sat with the American representative, who was not an ambassador at the time, and he talked through a 2-hour conversation as this is our country. And the whole idea was, of course, to get as an expansion like the smiling crocodile around the rim, the outer rim of Russia, who historically has had not enough of invasions from the West.
Right.
Then came Ukraine. And let me just say very quickly, everybody knows who has studied this and written books about it, that it was not Putin who started the regime change in Kiev. He reacted to what happened there, which I think was stupid and a clear violation of international law by annexing Crimea. But you also know that if Ukraine would become a NATO member, the third largest base in Crimea would be in danger.
Right.
And nobody should be surprised that he reacted to this.
Michael, let's try and look at this from the Russian viewpoint. It's a 10-day exercise involving some 31,000 troops, thousands of military vehicles. And as we pointed out, it's the single largest movement of foreign forces in Poland since World War II. Let's look at the recent history of Russia. Lost 20 million people during World War II, faced more German divisions on its front than the Allies, the Western Allies, faced on D-Day. Given that, does one begin to understand Russia's anxiety?
No, not on that point. I think that's incorrect. I think Jan is closer to being correct when he talked about the psychological and the broader historical ways in which NATO expanded after the Cold War ended, and how that both seemed to invalidate some of the promises that had been made, at least verbally, and seemed to be a triumphalist action. But the notion that 30,000 NATO troops from 20 different countries that have publicly explained and debated their purpose for this exercise are somehow preparing an attack on Russia doesn't hold water. And we've got to not give that kind of argument serious credence, okay? There are some Russian concerns that are worth debating, but that one simply doesn't even begin to hold water. So no, Russia doesn't have anything to fear from this exercise. And Russia did bring it upon itself because there are 10,000 people dead from what Russia's been doing in Ukraine the last 2 years. So even if Jan and I agree about the broad historical reasons why Putin could be angry about this, it doesn't justify killing 10,000 people. There is little ambiguity about who started the hot war in Ukraine. And Obama has been very careful not to provide the Ukrainian military with lethal weaponry. He's trying to give Putin a chance to back down. But he has a solemn pledge under Article 5 of the NATO treaty to protect any and all NATO members, and that has to be unambiguous. So even if I might quibble with the size of this exercise, I support its basic thrust.
Jan, do you want to respond to that? I've just got about a minute.
Yeah, I mean, we can't talk here just as though we were journalists looking at one point at one moment. This is what goes together over 25 years. This is that Russia has to say stop somewhere. This goes together with all other kinds of expansions and the building of the ballistic missile defense system, which bizarrely is argued is not against Russia, but about Iran being a threat to Europe. I mean, give me a break. I do think that this exercise is part of a much larger provocative pattern and not something we should look at in isolation.
Michael, very quickly, 20 seconds, please.
Well, they're not a military threat, and I do hope that we can see that this can be the end of it. I would like this to be the only large exercise of this type, and I hope we can actually negotiate some kind of an agreement with Putin and with Russia on a neutral zone, a new security architecture for the currently neutral states of Europe, so we don't have to worry about NATO expansion. But the condition for that is Russian withdrawal militarily from Ukraine. Okay, Michael O'Hanlon, Jan Oberg, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for joining us.